Hey everyone, welcome to Philosophy of Science for Scientists, Engineers, and Researchers. This is Paul, and in this video what I'm going to do is talk about the problem with the word science, and I'll talk about how this word is often misused, the word science, by science communicators, scientists themselves and science educators, and also professional philosophers. And of all these people, it's the professional philosophers who should definitely know better than this, because they're the ones who spend all this time analyzing language. So let's talk about what this is. So what this comes down to is an equivocation fallacy. Now, an equivocation is defined as the use of ambiguous language to conceal the truth or to avoid committing oneself. And sometimes an equivocation is used basically for, it may not be used on purpose to try to be nefarious. It may just be people are not really having a precise enough definition of the word, so they kind of use it in multiple places and aren't being consistent about it. So here's a good example of an equivocation type of fallacy. Premise 1. Only man is rational. Premise 2, no woman is a man. And the conclusion is therefore no woman is rational. Now the problem here is an equivocation over the use of the word man. Basically in the first premise we're using man and words can refer to multiple things, and that's okay. That's part of how language works. But in premise 1, man is referring to human. It's basically serving the purpose, or the reference in this term is referring to basically humankind. And then premise 2, man is referring to specifically male, because the word man is overloaded. It has multiple definitions. And we're using different definitions of the word to try to brush under the rug the fact that these are actually referring to two different things. So what I'm going to talk about here is an equivocation with the word science. Now, think about this following. This is a very similar issue, but this is an equivocation over the word science. Premise 1, science discovers truth about the world. Premise 2, supernatural things are outside of science. And the conclusion is, therefore, supernatural things are untrue, or the truth of supernatural things cannot be commented on. These sorts of things. Now, I think this actually would be a reasonably valid argument, at least if you're saying, if premise 1, you would need to specify it. Science is the only way to discover truth about the world, or the best sort of thing, or these other things. But in general, I think this is a fair argument. But the problem is what we're doing is we're equivocating science. In premise 1, we're basically using science as defined by its relationship with truth. Whereas in premise 2, we're actually using science to describe a certain set of assumptions or a methodology. And this link is only justified if these methodological constraints, or the constraints of science, are metaphysically justified. So in other words, what do we actually mean by science? Is science something that we use to come about to truth? Or is science just basically a priori defined by a certain set of operational assumptions for the sake of how it means? And if you think about it, just be careful. What I want you to do is notice the way the word science is often wielded, almost in an emotive sense. When somebody says, well, this is the science of it, it's settled, or something like this. Be very careful. Are they referring to the fact that there is data that shows this, or some falsifiable experiment, or something that's conformed to the methodological constraints? Is this even a scientific question? Or are they using science in a more broad sense about discovering truth? And be sure that somebody isn't using these two definitions interchangeably. Sometimes it's helpful to just ask, well, what do you mean by science? Let's make sure we're on the same page here. What are we meaning by science in this conversation, so we don't miss these things? Otherwise you get into these science wars. Oh, do you not trust the science, and these sorts of things? And it's very unproductive. But part of the problem is just not having a clear definition or agreed upon definition of what science is. Of course, you have a group of things that could at least possibly be true, and you have your assumptions of what we call natural philosophy or science. So depending on where this circle is, if this circle is investigating all the things that could possibly be true, then investigating astrology could be scientific. Or if we say, it's not scientific because it doesn't solve certain problems, or because it's untrue, those are different things, right? Saying astrology is untrue is different than saying we can't investigate it with science. So we need to be precise, right? Here's the problem. Either science is or the way of coming to truth, or science is constrained by a certain methodology. And you need to start with one of these and then argue your way to the other, because there's no necessary connection between the only way of coming to truth and there being some methodology for doing this. So you have to start with one, choose one, and argue to the other. So one of the ways you can do this, to see this link, is to make this link, is to say, premise 1, science is constrained by methodological naturalism, the scientific method, something like this. And premise 2, the results found by science are true. And the conclusion is, therefore, methodological naturalism and the scientific method produce truths. And now we have a conclusion that actually doesn't It doesn't have anything to do with science itself. This is a purely metaphysical or meta-scientific question. So this is not a scientific conclusion or question. And they explain the role, by my meta-scientific, what I mean is these explain the role of science and what its constraints or relationship to truth are. And you can't argue this non-circularly from the word science. You can't use science to come to the answer about whether science comes to truth, because that would be like arguing in a circle. That'd be like arguing, how do we know God is real? Because the Bible says so, and the Bible was written by God. It's like, wait a minute, you can't invoke God to prove God in that sort of, way. And in a similar way, we can't use the word science to say that science produces truths. We can't, we have to talk about something else. So that's what I mean about meta-scientific. Now, the rock and a hard place here is if we start with science as a way to discover truth, then we should be skeptical of any attempts to restrict its methodology a priori, unless that methodology is justified or metaphysically justified, right? So this is what James Davison Hunter says as a sociologist. Ruling out particular topics of discussion a priori is a rather undemocratic use of power. Now, of course, science isn't settled by democracy, at least, most of the time it's not. But in the context of debate or truth-seeking, this is really an aversion to scholarship, saying, okay, this is not scientific, so we're not going to investigate it. Okay, that's fair, but then you can't use the word science to say something is untrue if you're not going to give it a fair hearing. That's not how you do things. You don't just say, okay, this doesn't, we're going to, for the purposes of this discussion or this thing, we're only going to look at these things, and then we're going to rule out these other possible topics and just brush them under the rug. Like, that's not how you do scholarship. That's, it's just poor scholarship, really. And notice that these methodological restrictions are often done for other reasons beyond just whether the arguments are good or the theories are plausible, well supported by data. Often there's a funding reason. There can also be good reasons to do this just for definitional reasons. Like, hey, we want science to have this clear definition so we can teach it and it can be clear where these different fields are. So this is why we're going to do it. But understand that these are practical considerations. They have nothing to do with whether or not it's true. Definitions don't make things true, including or excluding things. What we care about is whether or not things are actually true, not whether something falls under a certain word or not. And then, you can go the other way around, right? If we start with science as conforming to a certain methodology, then we should be skeptical of any attempts to link the use of this method to truth because it's unable to consider or follow the evidence where it leads. As soon as the evidence leads out of its predefined circle, which it's defined kind of, I don't want to say ad hoc, but not for truth-seeking reasons, now you can no longer comment on whether or not you're able to find truth objectively. Maybe you can find truth within the constraints of this sort of thing, but you can't generalize it to the rest of the space. It's like, okay, the highest point in the world is basically, Hawaii, and I haven't gone outside of North America or the Eastern Hemisphere. You're not allowed to do that unless you actually investigate the rest of the world and see. So you can't rule out these things is kind of the point. So right, only to the extent that the methodology is justified metaphysically, you can make these sort of links. And one of the things we should ask is why would the scientific method allow us to come to truth? I mean, that's a good question. That's a fair question. And how do we know this? How do we know it, whether it's true or not, that scientific methodology allows us to come to truth? There's a lot of really interesting challenges to this. So I'm not trying to brush that under the rug. I'm not saying you shouldn't trust science, God forbid, or anything like that. But I just mean, let's be precise. Let's be careful about what we mean by the word science. Otherwise, people are going to be arguing that things are scientific for other reasons beyond the definitional reason. So here's an example, right? Consider neo-Darwinist materialism that says all of life can be described by unguided natural selection and mutation. Now, the question here is this unguided part falsifiable or justified? Is this a scientific statement, right? All of life can be described by unguided natural selection and mutation. If this is a scientific statement, I think we would expect its reverse to be as well. So if this is a falsifiable statement, a statement that can be investigated through the scientific method, then we would also expect, I think, not all of life can be described by unguided selection and mutation. So, if this is a scientific statement, can it be investigated? Is there any evidence that would lead one to, in a Popperian way, distrust it or not have as much evidence? And if you say this is a scientific statement, but its inverse is not, then we should be very skeptical of this claim, because this is no longer a truth-seeking claim. This is only true by basically definition. Because it can only consider one hypothesis and not evaluate competing hypotheses. Like, think about my analogy of trying to find the highest point in the world and only looking in your own country. Doesn't seem all that fair. So, the other thing I should mention, it is considered unscientific by many definitions of science to only look for confirming evidence and not evaluate competing hypotheses or not evaluate the explanatory scope of other competing hypotheses as well. So the conclusion here, really the main point, is be careful of people that use the word science to try and make metaphysical claims. And basically be sure whoever you're talking to and you yourself have a consistent and agreed upon definition of the word science. And sometimes it's just helpful. It's like, hey, can you give me a definition of what you're using by science? Just make sure your disagreement isn't over the definition of the word science. And maybe you agree on something far more fundamental. It's just you're using the word in a specific different way. And the disagreement comes from the equivocation there. So that's my point here. Let me know what you think. What do you mean by science? And do you think this word is often misused, or often a lot of the technicalities of this word get brushed under the rug? Let me know. Anyway, thanks for watching.